Hey, everybody, welcome to Thinking Theology. What do you think the probability is that you are right on every single thing that you believe within the context of your theology? Every particular doctrine, every particular thought. What do you think the probability is? And I'm going to say it's the same basically as mine, which is 0. There is virtually no chance that you're right or that I'm right on everything that I think. This will promote kindness, in my opinion. Obviously, it's my opinion. I'm the one giving it. But as far as becoming a kinder people, whether religious, whether atheistic, no matter what, whatever we believe, there's virtually no chance that we're not going to change our mind on something down the line. So I'm going to go through a few things, though, specifically for people who adhere to biblical texts for their guide in life as far as it being the revealed word of God, and that you've interpreted it just so. I'm going to point out a few things that might help you understand what you're dealing with when you make such a claim that you've got it all right. First, the Bible wasn't written as a compilation. It was collected later from letters that were found basically scattered throughout the Roman Empire and other places in the Middle East where they were voted on later. These letters that were found, there were thousands of letters that were discovered, and there were tens of thousands probably that were just lost, or just never thought to be kept. Because the letters that were written that are now in our contemporary Bibles were not written to be part of a compilation. So these letters were written by different people over a period of roughly 20 to 90 years. And they said within the context of their writings that they're giving their opinions for things. And so their memories faded over time. The likelihood that they got those events right, or the memories of things that were said exactly right, is highly unlikely. So this is just a statement that there's a reduction in certainty as to whether or not, when we read the letters in the Bible, that we're reading something that was absolutely right, even in its own time. And then church councils were held hundreds of years later to determine which letters that existed that were found should be voted into the canon of the church. And these votes weren't unanimous. So if you want to know whether or not the likelihood what you're reading is actually the best account of what took place at the time, you decide whether or not that's an absolutely certain thing. If you think God is in control of everything, then fine. Then conversation is off the table, because then our free will and our ideas don't matter. But if you think that our free will matters and that we do impact things, then the people who wrote those letters and the people who voted them in had an impact on what we read today in those texts. And then only you can decide whether or not you think that's absolutely certain, or whether you should open your mind up, so to speak, to considering that there may be other ways of approaching it. So there were thousands of letters that were not voted into the canon. And if you haven't read those letters, I haven't, I've read some of them, but very few. But of the thousands that were omitted, maybe you would have voted some of those to be included in it. So this is just food for thought as far as your certainty goes. That's what this is about. It was a style of the time. It doesn't exist now in America or the UK or Europe because of copyright laws. But back then, when those letters were written, one way in which people would gain an audience for what their ideas were was to attribute their letters that they would write to someone else who did have respect. Because then it was more important about getting their ideas across. And if they were getting frustrated with people not having an audience, they would write a letter and they would say that it would be from Paul or John or James or some other well-known figure of the time. So, for example, of the 13 letters that are attributed to Paul, among scholars, it's basically regarded that he wrote 7 of them are sort of confirmed, and the other 6 is pretty well known that there's either dispute or he didn't write them. How close the people who wrote those letters were to Paul is a matter of other discussion, but the fact that he didn't write those also adds to an additional level of uncertainty about not merely the authenticity of it, but the accuracy in it, which, of course, if we're relying on those texts for our version of truth, then we have to question that and take that into account and say, all right, the source may not be the proper source or the one that I always thought it was. And so maybe I don't have a complete lock on things. That's all this is about. The writers of those letters themselves said in those letters and Paul included, that they were giving their opinions or their judgments, or that these words were coming from them. And so the idea that it's the word of God, that God communicated to these people perfectly somehow, without some mechanism, without some further explanation as to how that could be, then that does reduce the certainty that what you're reading and how you're understanding it is going to be some resemblance or semblance of exact, precise truth, such that there's no possibility that you're wrong about something. And this, by the way, isn't to indict you or to indict me. It's to say, reduce the pressure of being right. You've got to be absolutely right, or God's going to hammer you on this. Well, the means of being absolutely right don't exist in the way that we might like it to exist. But it takes some pressure off us to actually get everything right. We can try and make the best case, but we could always be wrong in a given thing. And another thing is, the Bible wasn't written in English. So it's a translation. Not only is it a translation from Aramaic or Hebrew or Greek into English, it's older Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek into contemporary English. And the translational difficulties of idioms and expressions and even words themselves and how they were used presents a great difficulty to someone postulating that they've got it exactly right. If you compare different translations, like the Darby to the King James, to the New King James, to the ESV, and so on, you'll see they read very, very differently, sometimes saying the opposite of what another version says. So that all implies a reduction in certainty in pronouncing ourselves as absolutely right in our theological beliefs. Idioms, for example, existed then that don't exist now, like the linguistic challenges. For instance, then even in Middle English, where the expression "God is awful," well, that today in America, that expression, when you say something is awful, you're like, oh, like if you're eating a meal and you're like, oh my gosh, the fish is awful. That means it's terrible. God is awful in Middle English and earlier English or Aramaic, the way people would have used it would mean he's full of awe, like awesome is the way we would say it. So these idiomatic differences mean that if your understanding isn't exactly right, then you might be wrong or have something incomplete. And this one can be upsetting to people because they can be hard to detect that there are forgeries in the Bible. There are known forgeries like 1 John 5:7, which features prominently in the Unitarian Trinitarian debate. But there are known forgeries. There are known mistranslations and additions that scribes put in and so forth. But there may be some that are undetected. Most scholars will acknowledge that there are probably some verses or words that found their way into the texts that were forged later. And so our assessment of ourselves of having the truth, again, there's a reduction in certainty in that claim. When we hang out with a certain group, our church, our fellowship, if it's a home fellowship, whatever our particular group is with whom we fellowship or study, we tend to adopt those ideas more readily because we human beings are social creatures. One of the things that makes us human, if you will, is our cooperation among one another. We like to get along with one another, generally speaking. And when we hang out with an ideologically based group, which is what a particular religion is, or a particular politics, or what have you, an ideologically based group, we tend to adopt the ideas of the group so we don't rock the boat. They're able to make their cases to us. Our guard is down when they're our friends. And so we hear the logic behind what they're saying. And it's easier to adopt the ideas of that group. So if you find yourself in that camp or doing sort of more inclined to agree with the group, that may make yourself more suspect to agreeing with something merely because it's being presented to you over and over again versus a more rigorous process of examination. So all of these things, if you contemplate them, they produce a reduction in certainty in what your ideas are. And so this should create a sense of moderation among us, or kindness, or thoughtfulness, or more agreeable, where we listen to one another more just to see, well, maybe you're making a better case for something than the one that I'm making. This is just a few ways in which things that you could look at to see if you have things correct. So before we pronounce ourselves absolutely right or someone else is wrong, maybe we could say, I believe certain things and here's what they are. Or, okay, I hear what you believe and it's not what I believe, but I'll think about it, or what have you. It may just lead to greater civility among one another. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys. All right, leave your comments. Leave if you have any things you want me to cover too. I'd be happy to consider it. Have a great day. See you on another video and keep thinking theology. And most of all, be kind.